Every room at Northwestern Memorial smelled of antiseptic and fresh linen, a combination that had become achingly familiar over the past 18 hours. I had been awake since 4 a.m. when the anesthesia finally released its grip, and the reality of my situation settled over me like a second blanket, heavier and far less comforting than the hospital-issued one. The appendectomy had been emergency surgery, the kind that happens on a Tuesday evening when you're in the middle of reviewing blueprints, and the pain becomes so absolute you stop being able to stand upright. My assistant had called the ambulance. My husband had been notified immediately. That was 14 hours ago. The chair beside my bed was empty. I told myself there was an explanation. He was stuck in traffic. His phone had died. The parking situation near Northwestern was genuinely terrible. I constructed a series of reasonable scaffolding around his absence, the way I construct buildings methodically with purpose, determined to make something functional out of available materials. But scaffolding is temporary by design. It comes down eventually. At 6:47 a.m., a notification arrived on my phone. Not a call, not a message asking how I was feeling or when I could be discharged. It was a photo. My husband had been tagged in a post by someone named Devin, a man I vaguely recognized as a college friend of his who worked in private equity. The photo showed a table of 8 at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse, the kind of place where a single entree costs what most people pay for a week of groceries. My husband was center frame, his arm around Devin's shoulders, his face flushed and animated in the way it gets after his second glass of scotch. The caption read, "Finally getting the band back together. Boys are back." The timestamp was 11:34 p.m. the previous night. While I was in surgery, my husband was at a reunion dinner. While I was in recovery, he was at an after-party somewhere, unreachable. I set the phone face down on the bed tray and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. There was a small water stain near the light fixture, a pale brown ring no larger than my fist. I focused on it with the same concentrated attention I give to load-bearing problems in a structural design, something concrete, something that occupied the part of my brain that was trying very hard not to process what I was feeling. My discharge nurse came in at 9. She was efficient and warm and asked if my ride was on the way. I told her yes. Then I opened my phone and called my husband 4 consecutive times. The first 2 went to voicemail immediately. The third rang through. The fourth he answered. His voice was thick with sleep. Hey, I was going to call you this morning. How are you feeling?" I described the humiliation of the previous night with deliberate surgical precision. The surgery, the recovery room, the empty chair. 18 hours. He said he was sorry. He said it had gotten late and he hadn't wanted to wake me. He said Devin had been in town only for the night and I had been unconscious anyway. So what difference would it have made for him to sit in a hospital waiting room watching me sleep? He said these things in a tone that suggested he was explaining something to someone who was being slightly unreasonable. Then he said, "Can you get an Uber? I can Venmo you for it." I hung up. The Uber to our home in Lincoln Park took 22 minutes. The driver was a soft-spoken man who offered me his aux cord and didn't ask questions, which was the precise amount of human kindness I could manage without breaking. I sat in the back seat in the discharge clothes my assistant had brought the night before. A loose sweater and sweatpants holding a small paper bag of prescriptions against my abdomen where the incisions were still sore enough to make every bump in the road register as a personal insult. Our building had a doorman. His name was Gerald, and he had worked the morning shift since before my husband and I had moved in 3 years earlier. When he saw me come through the revolving door alone, holding myself at a careful angle, his face moved through several expressions before landing on a practiced neutrality that somehow made everything worse. "Mrs. Calloway, can I help you with anything?" I told him I was fine. I was not fine. The apartment was exactly as I had left it Tuesday evening. My blueprints still spread across the dining table, my coffee mug still on the counter with its ring of dried residue. The only evidence that my husband had been home at all was a half-empty bottle of water on his nightstand and a suit jacket thrown over the back of his chair. He had come home, slept, and left again, presumably to sleep off whatever Gibson's had done to him somewhere I couldn't monitor. I sat on the edge of the bed and did not cry. I had learned not to cry from my father. A lesson delivered not through words, but through consistent demonstration over 42 years of watching him navigate catastrophe with an expression of absolute, considered calm. Tears were not useful. Tears did not solve load-bearing problems. What I did instead was open the banking app on my phone and look at our joint account. The balance was $47,000 lower than it had been on Monday. I looked at this number for a long time. Then I called my father. He answered on the second ring. He always answers on the second ring, a habit so consistent it has become a kind of private reassurance, proof that somewhere in the world, one person is always within reach. "Sweetheart." His voice was warm and immediate, the particular warmth of a man who has been waiting for exactly this call without knowing it. "I just got off with your mother." "How are you feeling? Do you need me to send someone over?" I told him where I'd been for the past 18 hours. I told him about the empty chair. I told him about Gibson's Steakhouse and the photo and the 4 phone calls and the suggestion that I take an Uber and the fact that he could Venmo me for it. I told him about the $47,000. I delivered this information the way I present a project to a client, factually, sequenced, without editorial decoration, because the facts were decoration enough. When I finished, the line was quiet for several seconds. "The joint account," my father said finally. "Is your name primary?" "Yes. The apartment, the deed in my name only. Premarital asset, protected by the prenuptial agreement my father's attorney had insisted on and my husband had signed without apparent concern 3 years ago." "Good." The single word carried the weight of a decision already made. "I'm calling Margaret now. She will be at your apartment within 2 hours. You will do exactly what she says. Are you listening to me?" Margaret Chen had been my father's chief legal counsel for 19 years. I had known her since I was 12 years old, when she had come to our house in Winnetka for a Sunday dinner and quietly taken apart a business adversary of my father's over dessert using nothing but publicly available financial records and a calm, relentless logic that I had found deeply impressive even then. If my father was calling Margaret, the situation had been officially reclassified. I said I understood. "One more thing," he said, and his voice had changed in the way it changes when he is no longer speaking as my father, but as the man who built a real estate development company from a single commercial property in 1987 into an organization that employed over 4,000 people across 9 states. "That $47,000, find out where it went. Don't move anything, don't transfer anything, just find out where it went. Margaret will do the rest." He hung up. I opened the banking app again. The transfer had gone to an account I didn't recognize, routing number I didn't recognize in my husband's name only. It had been initiated at 2:16 a.m. on Wednesday morning while I was in post-operative recovery and he was presumably in a rideshare somewhere between Gibson's and our apartment. Margaret arrived at 10:48 a.m. She came with 2 associates and a woman I didn't recognize who carried a laptop bag and introduced herself only as Claire, which told me she was the kind of specialist whose last name wasn't shared in mixed company. Margaret herself looked exactly as she always did, composed in a way that suggested composure was not a mood but a structural feature, like a foundation poured correctly and left to cure. She did not offer condolences. She sat across from me at the dining table, moved my blueprints to one side without looking at them, and said, "Tell me everything, and tell me in order." I did. I was good at telling things in order. It was the core skill of my profession, understanding how one structural decision leads inevitably to the next, how a choice made in the design phase appears 15 months later as a consequence in the finished building. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she turned to her associates. "Freeze the joint account. Flag the transfer as unauthorized pending investigation. I want a full forensic trace on that routing number by noon." She turned back to me. "The prenuptial agreement. I have a copy. I need yours." It was in the fireproof safe in the home office, the same safe where we kept our passports and the original deed to the apartment and a few pieces of jewelry I had inherited from my grandmother. I gave her the combination. She opened it, found the prenuptial agreement, and handed it to one of her associates without looking at its contents. She already knew its contents. She had written half of it. Then she pulled out the other documents in the safe and laid them on the table. There was a passport I didn't recognize, not my husband's American passport, which I knew well, a well-traveled navy blue with a worn spine. This was a second passport, Canadian, issued 18 months ago, bearing my husband's photograph and a name I had never heard. There was also a thin folder containing what appeared to be lease agreements and that unfamiliar name, for a furnished apartment in the Lakeview neighborhood, 3 miles from where we were sitting. Margaret looked at these items with an expression that did not change. "Did you know he had Canadian citizenship?" she asked. "No." "Did you know about the apartment?" "No." "All right." She said this in the tone of a physician who has received a test result consistent with what she already suspected. Claire had her laptop open. Over the next 2 hours, sitting at my dining table with my architectural blueprints stacked on the credenza and a half-drunk glass of water in front of me that one of the associates kept quietly refilling, I watched Margaret and her team dismantle the financial architecture of my marriage with the focused efficiency of a demolition crew that has studied the blueprints in advance. The $47,000 was traced to a personal account my husband had opened 14 months ago, a month after our first wedding anniversary. It was not the only transfer. There had been 23 others over the preceding year, smaller amounts between $2,000 and $8,000, originating from the joint brokerage account where we held shared investments. In total, he had moved $134,000 out of our marital asset pool into an account I had no knowledge of and no access to. The Canadian passport was real and legally obtained through a citizenship application my husband had filed based on a Canadian grandmother he had mentioned to me exactly once, in passing, as a piece of family trivia. He had not mentioned that he had quietly pursued the citizenship, or that he had obtained it, or that he had used it to open financial accounts in a second name. The Lakeview apartment lease was in its second year of a 2-year term. The emergency contact listed on the application was a woman named Renata, last name not yet confirmed. I sat with all of this information for a moment, arranging it in my mind the way I arrange structural elements, finding the load-bearing relationship between them, understanding which piece supported which. He had started the secret account a month after our first anniversary. He had obtained the Canadian passport the same year. The apartment in Lakeview was a 10-minute drive from our building. This was not a reaction to our marriage. This was a plan that predated any version of our marriage I had been living inside. My phone rang. My husband. I looked at Margaret. "Let it ring," she said. "Every missed call is documented." It rang 4 more times over the next hour. Then a text arrived. "Hey, where are you?" "I'm home. You okay?" Then 3 minutes later, "Babe, come on. I heard you got discharged this morning." "I'm sorry about last night. Can we talk?" Margaret read the text without expression. "He's in the apartment?" Gerald had just confirmed it via a call to building management. My husband had returned approximately 20 minutes ago. "Good," Margaret said, and I had never heard that word sound so much like a door locking. She walked to the intercom panel by the entrance and pressed the button to connect to the lobby. Gerald answered. She gave him a precise, quiet set of instructions. He acknowledged them. She released the button. Then her phone rang. She answered, listened for 40 seconds and said, "Send it to my email and begin the process." She ended the call and looked at me. "The routing number Claire traced," she said. "The account your husband opened 14 months ago is held jointly with Renata Sousa, a graphic designer currently residing at the Lakeview address. The transfer history shows deposits from our marital assets and withdrawals consistent with rent payments, furniture purchases, and 2 international flights to Cancun and to Vancouver." The sound that came out of me was not a word. It was not quite a sob either. It was something that had been held under pressure for several hours and needed a small release valve before it could be contained again. Margaret waited for it to pass with the patience of someone who has sat in a great many rooms where people received terrible information. "I know," she said, which was not a platitude coming from her. It was an acknowledgement. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I recognized as belonging to my husband's mother. "Sweetheart, I heard about your surgery. Please take care of yourself. Whatever is happening between you and my son, remember that family comes first. I stared at it, then put my phone face down. The intercom from the lobby crackled. My husband's voice filled the room, sharper than I had ever heard it, stripped of the careful social calibration he usually maintained in company. What do you mean I can't go up? I live here. Take your hand off the elevator button, Gerald. I am not joking. Margaret pressed the intercom button. Your husband has been served via digital delivery to the email address on file with a notice of exclusive occupancy, temporarily granting your client sole use of the marital residence pending legal proceedings. He is also being served in person by a process server currently in the lobby with the accompanying documentation. She spoke the way she would in a deposition, precisely, without effect. I'd recommend he review the documents and contact his own legal counsel. There was a silence. Then my husband's voice came back at a different pitch entirely. No longer polished, no longer considered. The voice of a man who has understood in a single sudden moment the geometry of what has happened to him. Put her on, he said. I need to talk to her right now. Put her on the phone. All communication should be directed through my office, Margaret said. Good morning. She released the intercom button. The lobby fell silent. A minute later, my phone began ringing continuously. His number, again and again, and the texts came fast after that, escalating through confusion and then hurt, and then a cold and very specific fury that told me he had understood not just that something had changed, but exactly how much had changed, and precisely who had changed it. Your father? The last text read, Of course, you couldn't handle this yourself. You had to run to your father. Fine. You want to play it this way? You have no idea what I'm capable of. I showed the text to Margaret. She photographed it, time-stamped it, and forwarded it to her associate without comment. That evening, my father called. He had been on the phone most of the day, a fact I knew not because he told me, but because I understood how his mind worked, the same way I understand how a structure under stress redistributes its load. When things became serious, he became quiet. He had been very quiet. The citizenship and the account, he said, are consistent with a man who was building an exit route. The question is the timeline. Whether he started this before the marriage or after. He paused. The account opened 14 months ago is after. But Margaret is looking at something earlier. The Canadian citizenship application began 4 months before you were married. I let this settle. He applied for the second passport while he was proposing to you? While he was in the process of proposing to you, yes. I thought about the proposal, a dinner at Oriole, candlelight, a ring I had later learned was purchased on my husband's mother's credit card and repaid in installments. I thought about how moved I had been, how I'd read his nervousness as sincerity. I thought about the word sincerity and what it actually meant, and whether I had ever had sufficient evidence for the conclusion I had drawn. What do you want to do? My father asked. What I want, I said, choosing the words carefully, is for every door he thought was open to be closed. Not just the financial ones, all of them. My father was quiet for a moment. Margaret will move tomorrow on the brokerage accounts. The $134,000 constitutes provable fraudulent transfer from marital assets, combined with a secret identity documentation and the evidence of a concurrent relationship. We have grounds for an annulment on fraud in addition to divorce for cause. The financial penalties will be substantial. And professionally? Another pause. Your husband's firm has 3 anchor clients. 2 of them are subsidiaries of companies that have done business with Callaway Development for a combined total of 20 years. I made 2 calls this afternoon. Both CEOs were troubled to learn about the conduct of a representative they had trusted with confidential client information. He said this in the tone of a man reporting a weather forecast. Both contracts are under review. The precision of it, the quiet, enormous leverage of it, reminded me why people sometimes spoke about my father in tones they usually reserved for natural phenomena. Daddy, I said. Yes. Thank you. You don't thank me for this, he said simply. This is what fathers are for. My best friend called at 9 that evening. She had been texting since morning, increasingly frantic messages I had been too submerged to answer, and when she finally reached me, her voice had the particular quality of someone who has been rehearsing what to say and has now abandoned all of it. "Are you okay? Where are you? I saw your husband posting on Instagram from Gibson's last night and I thought, that can't be right. She just had surgery and then I called the hospital and they wouldn't tell me anything." I told her. All of it, methodically, in the order it had occurred. She was quiet for a long time. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, "and I need you to know that I thought about telling you before and I talked myself out of it and I had been sitting with that decision for months, and I think it was wrong." 3 months before our wedding, she'd been at a rooftop event in River North. She had seen my husband in a corner of the terrace. Not with me, I hadn't attended, but with a woman she didn't recognize, dark-haired, very polished, and they were standing close in the way that people stand when they believe they are not being observed. My husband had said something that made the woman laugh, and then they had moved inside together, and my best friend had stood there for several minutes telling herself she had misread it, that it was a colleague, that she was projecting, that she would not ruin my happiness over a moment she couldn't prove meant anything. "She had a tattoo on her left wrist," my best friend said. "A small compass." I remember it. Renata Souza had a compass tattoo on her left wrist. I had seen it in the photographs Claire had pulled from her public social media accounts. "It's not your fault," I said, because it was true, and because she needed to hear it. "I should have told you." "He should not have done it," I said. "Those are different things." The next 72 hours were a controlled demolition. Margaret filed in Cook County Circuit Court for dissolution of marriage on grounds of fraud and for an emergency order freezing all remaining joint assets. She filed simultaneously for an injunction on the fraudulent transfer, naming the joint account held with Renata Souza as the destination of improperly moved marital funds. The Canadian passport documentation was submitted as evidence of concealed identity and intent to evade, which transformed what had been a civil matter into something with a harder, more criminal edge. My husband, who had retained an attorney of his own, a man whose full-page advertisements appeared in the back of a local business magazine, issued a statement through that attorney, suggesting that I had acted impulsively and vindictively in response to what was, at its core, a marital disagreement, and that his client was a devoted husband who had made a single, regrettable error in judgment by not being present at the hospital, an error he deeply regretted and for which he was prepared to offer a full and sincere apology. The statement did not mention the Canadian passport. It did not mention the $134,000. It did not mention the apartment in Lakeview, or the 2 years of international travel with Renata Souza, or the fact that his application for a second identity had begun 4 months before he stood at an altar and made a set of legally binding promises. Margaret issued a 3-paragraph response that addressed none of these omissions directly and simply noted that full discovery would be requested and that her client looked forward to the court's review of all available documentation. She was, I had come to understand, a woman who understood the value of letting the other side speak first and at length. The turning point came from an unexpected direction. A journalist I respected, a woman who covered architecture and design for a national magazine, reached out through my firm's PR contact. She had heard about the legal proceedings, she said, but more than that, she had heard about the Callaway Center project, the mixed-income housing development my firm had been designing for the past 2 years in partnership with my father's company, a project that was finally moving toward groundbreaking. She wanted to profile me, not about the divorce, about the work. I sat with this for a day. Margaret advised caution. My father said it was my choice. My best friend said, "You built something real and important, and you are not going to let him be the story." The interview was conducted in my office, surrounded by models and drawings, Liam waiting in the background as something larger than either of them. I wore a gray blazer and my grandmother's ring, and I sat with my hands loose on the desk, and I spoke about the Callaway Center with the genuine love I had always had for it, the way it was designed to create density without anonymity, to make people feel held by a building rather than contained by it. An hour in, the journalist asked, with the careful gentleness of someone who has earned the question, whether I wanted to speak to what had been in the news. I took one breath. I had emergency surgery, I said. And when I was discharged from the hospital, I took a rideshare home alone, because my husband was not there and did not come. That was a clarifying experience. I paused, looking not at the journalist, but at the model of the Callaway Center on the table beside us, all those carefully designed windows oriented toward light. A building that cannot hold its own weight, cannot hold anyone else's. I learned very early in my training that the most dangerous structural failures are the ones where the weakness was present from the beginning, hidden inside a load-bearing element that looked sound from the outside. When you find that weakness, you don't argue with it. You redesign around it. The piece ran 4 days later. The response was immediate and disproportionate in the way that things sometimes become disproportionate when they have touched something true. The phrase redesign around it was quoted in context I had not anticipated. Women sent messages to my firm's contact address. Former classmates wrote. An architecture nonprofit asked me to keynote their annual conference. My husband's attorney sent a formal complaint to the journalist's publication, claiming the interview constituted a deliberate campaign of reputational damage. The publication's legal team responded in one sentence and published both letters as a follow-up piece. The court date arrived on a gray Thursday morning in October. I attended in person. My husband arrived with his attorney, and I looked at him across the aisle for the first time since the morning I had come home from the hospital, and I found that I felt nothing recognizable as grief. What I felt was something closer to the feeling you get when you finish a structural analysis and the numbers confirm what you already knew. The judge reviewed the filings with the efficiency of someone who has seen many variations of this particular architecture of betrayal. The fraudulent transfer was provable and quantified. The concealed identity documentation established a pattern of deception that predated the marriage by 4 months, which in the court's view substantially supported the fraud-based annulment claim. The concurrent relationship was documented, and the funds used to support it were traceable to marital assets. My husband's attorney argued that the transfers had been for a legitimate joint investment that had not yet been documented, that the Canadian citizenship was a private family matter with no bearing on the marriage, and that his client's failure to be present at the hospital, while regrettable, did not rise to the level of actionable abandonment. The judge looked at him for a moment. "Counsel," she said, "your client opened a bank account and a second legal identity during the period of his engagement, transferred $134,000 from shared marital assets to that account over the course of 14 months, used those funds in part to maintain a residence shared with another woman, and was absent from a medical emergency in which his spouse required surgery, discharge, and transportation home alone. Is there a portion of this fact pattern you'd like to revisit?" His attorney did not revisit it. The dissolution was granted. The annulment on fraud grounds was granted. The fraudulent transfer was ordered reversed in full with interest. My husband left the courtroom with the clothes he was wearing, a lease on a studio apartment in Evanston, and a legal bill he would be managing for years. 2 weeks later, Margaret called with a different kind of news. Federal investigators have been building a case against Renata Sousa for the past several months related to a wire fraud scheme involving fabricated investment products sold to small business owners. My husband, it emerged, had not merely been a passive participant in his own secondary life. He had been an active recruiter for the scheme, using contacts he had made through his legitimate consulting work to direct clients toward the fraudulent products. He had been paid in cash, deposited directly to the account Margaret had already frozen. He was arrested on a Wednesday morning. I learned about it from Margaret, not from the news, and I sat with the information for a long time before I called my father. "It's over," I said. "All of it." My father was quiet for a moment. "Not over," he said. "Different." He was right, as he usually is about these things. The legal machinery stopped. The article stopped. The world moved on to its next crisis, its next story, its next version of the ancient drama of someone discovering that what they thought they had built was not structurally sound. But the world I was living in had changed its load-bearing configuration entirely. I moved into the apartment alone and remade it slowly, the way you renovate a space that has good bones but needs to be rethought. I donated the leather sofa. I opened up the home office that had been his territory. I put my drafting table in front of the window with the best light and worked there in the mornings before the rest of the city fully woke. The Callaway Center broke ground on a Tuesday in November. I stood in hard hat and work boots on a piece of Southside Chicago that was about to become something. My father beside me, my best friend behind me, a photographer from the Tribune capturing the moment. The first shovel broke ground at 900 n.m., and I held it with both hands and felt the resistance of the earth against it. That specific, satisfying pushback of something real and solid, meeting something determined. My father put his arm around my shoulders afterward, a gesture so rare from him that I understood immediately it was significant. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. I knew what it was. I had known it was coming for several months, from the particular quality of his attention during our calls, the way he had been describing certain board dynamics in more detail than was strictly necessary, the way my mother had begun asking casual questions about whether I found the work at my firm still fulfilling, or whether I was thinking about next phases. "The development company," I said. "You know me too well. I learned from the best." He turned to look at the groundbreaking site, the crew already moving with the focused energy of people who have waited for this day. "I'm not as young as I was when I started this," he said, "and I've been building it for you since before you were old enough to know I was doing it, not because I need a legacy. Because you are the most structurally sound person I have ever met, and this company needs someone who understands how to build things that last." He paused. "But only if you want it. On your terms." "I won't presume." I looked at the site, at the footprint of what would become something real and habitable and designed to hold people safely inside it. "I want it," I said. "But I want to keep the firm. Of course. And I want the foundation to be part of the corporate identity. Not a sidebar, not a charitable write-off, the actual headline." My father looked at me for a long moment, then he smiled, which on his face is a precise and specific thing, not broad, not effusive, but absolutely genuine. "Done," he said. The foundation had been my idea from the beginning, conceived in a recovery room with an empty chair beside me and a photo of a steakhouse on my phone. It was structured to support women navigating the particular financial devastation of fraudulent marriages, offering legal resources, housing assistance, and professional rebuilding programs. I had named it quietly, without announcement, after a principle I had learned in my first structural engineering course and never forgotten. Every sound building begins with an honest assessment of the ground beneath it. You cannot build on a false foundation and expect the structure to hold. What looks like stability from the outside is only as real as the truth buried underneath it. I had built something on a false foundation and it had failed. The difference between that and a building collapse is that a person can walk away from the rubble, look at what remains, understand what went wrong at the load-bearing level, and begin again on ground that has been properly tested. At the Foundation's first public event, a winter evening in a downtown gallery space filled with women who had each, in their own way, survived the specific humiliation of discovering that they had been deceived by someone they had chosen to trust. I stood at the front of the room and did not give a speech. I gave a structural analysis. I talked about foundations. I talked about what good bones look like and how to identify them. I talked about the difference between a design that looks complete and a design that is actually sound. After, my best friend found me near the drinks table and handed me a glass of sparkling water. "You know," she said, "most people give inspiration speeches at these things." "That was an inspiration speech," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "I guess it was." I looked around the room at all those women, different ages, different stories, the same underlying architecture of survival. And I thought about the recovery room at Northwestern Memorial and the empty chair and the 14 hours and the way I had looked at the ceiling and focused on a water stain because it was the only solid thing in my field of vision. I had walked out of that building alone and I had rebuilt everything, not back to what it was, because what it was had never been sound, but forward, into something I had designed myself. load-bearing in every element, oriented toward light, built to hold. The story I had thought I was living was over. The one I was actually telling had barely begun.